Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Conversations with Nicole show. I'm Nicole Huckabee. My guest today is Seth David Radwell, an internationally recognized business executive and best-selling author of American Schism, a groundbreaking book that traces the roots of America's polarization and offers a path towards healing and reconciliation. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Conversations with Nicole. I am delighted to have as my guest today Seth David Radwell. He is the author of American Schism. So good to have you on the show. Welcome.
Thank you, Nicole. I'm thrilled to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Before we get to your book, which is something that everyone needs to read and know about, give folks a little bit about your background. You have a very interesting business background.
Well, thank you. Yes, most of my career has been in business. I've been fortunate to have built a wonderful career. I was most recently a CEO of Proactive, the acne skincare brand, but I've led many other businesses in consumer products. And before that, I was an executive in publishing. So it's my focus has been on marketing. That's what I'm known for. But about 5 years ago, I was increasingly concerned about the state of our dialogue, our discourse in the US, how I felt it collapsed. And so I started doing some research, which led me to write American Schism and to do the work I do now. So it has been a shift, but I should also say that I do have roots in public policy and government. I studied that in graduate school, some 35 years ago.
Just a few years ago, right?
Yes, right.
In doing my research, I found it interesting that you said 77% of us are the exhausted majority. Explain that. I feel like
Sure.
I'm amongst that 77%.
Yes, well, that's what's so interesting is so this is what I found in my research. It turns out if you look at various quantitative studies that have been done, about 70% of Americans believe we have more in common with each other than that divides us, in other words. But yet, if you listen to the news or plug into any of the dialogue, you would think that we're all so divided. And of course, we are somewhat divided. But on the core issues, we're actually much more unified than one thinks. And this is a phenomenon. I call it the paradox of the frustrated majority. So why is it a paradox? It's a paradox for two reasons. First of all, it actually is 77, between 70 and 80%, let's say. It is the majority. But because the extremes get the gavel, they have the speakership. They're the ones with the megaphone. We always hear them. And let's not forget, Nicole, that whether it's them being very loud or whether it's media models which need sensationalism to sell stories to get eyes, it's often those extremes that get the attention. So the majority, though, is in fact part of this group that believes we have more in common. And the other thing that's unique about this frustrated majority, sometimes I call it the exhausted majority, is that they believe there has to be a more productive way to solve our problems. That screaming at each other over Twitter or social media or even cable news, that's not the best way to solve problems. So that's what I mean by the frustrated majority. So that's what, and it's a paradox again because they are actually a majority. They feel minoritarian. They feel like they're a minority because the voices on the extremes are so loud.
Right. That makes perfect sense to me. I mean, I actually feel that very same way. And I was a member of the media, and I know there are a lot of good souls that are in media, but I can see where people can get frustrated with what they see and the sound bites and what they hear and think, okay, well, that person is screaming the loudest about this. And so how does that relate into to we getting, us getting beyond
Yes.
the loudness and the divisiveness and coming together? That's really what you've studied. And you say this is nothing new.
Right. Well, thank you for that because that's exactly what I studied. In fact, in many ways, the book American Schism is an investigative tracing of the history of our divisions back to the founding. So when I did leave my career and started doing this work, I was convinced that the divisions we see today must have roots. They must have antecedents in our history. They didn't come from nowhere. So I was determined to get to those roots. And I believe, having done that research and spending a lot of time on this, I firmly believe that we can't really heal today. We can't heal the current American schism without understanding where it comes from. That history is important, and history can act as a salve for our wounds if we apply it. So, in a nutshell, and I do hope your listeners will check out the book. But what I would say is that after looking at this original split, this original American schism that happened at our founding, right in the 18th century during the Enlightenment, we then trace in the book 5 periods of our history in which we were very divided. So what you just said is right. Being divided is not new. What
Yes.
is strange, or what is a little bit challenging, is how we're dealing with it. So once you look at those different episodes, one can distill some lessons, and the lessons are almost like, Nicole, sometimes I call it a secret sauce. There's a way we've handled our divisions that's been productive, and other ways that have been much more violent. And so that's my embrace and my call to action for Americans, who are in fact in this exhausted majority, is to understand what our lessons are, our secret sauce from history. And there are a couple of them which I can share with you today. But
Yes, please do.
yeah, but what I would say is that we're not, whether it's the media or whether it's the dialogue that you hear often in public, it's not really following that secret sauce. So what does the secret sauce say? So when we've been divided like we are now, we've had better outcomes. We've succeeded. By the way, not always resolving all differences, but moving past them through a more productive path. What have we used? I would say there are 3 elements of this secret sauce, and the book describes this. The first one, the first element is what I call operating in a pragmatic framework that's focused on problem solving, or an empirical framework. So, in other words, one of the things that's so important in solving problems is using data. And in today's world, it feels like everyone's entitled to their own facts. But when you're looking at problems, especially problems that have empirical information, using the data and letting the data drive the thinking as opposed to the emotions, it's not always easy. It's challenging, but that proves to be the better path. Now,
Well,
yes.
with emotions, people often don't have intelligence that comes with emotions because they're emotional. That's probably the disconnect there.
Yes, yes, and in fact, one of the things that I think I pride myself on coming from such a successful career in business is, I mean, business leaders often use data to try to come up with solutions. That's kind of the world we operate in. And what I talk about in the book and write about is that some of the incentives in the public sphere have gotten away from that. It's some public officials, and I'm not going to say all, but many public officials are concerned about getting reelected, and pushing buttons or getting us agitated is sometimes a way to do that. But as we know in the private sector, if we want to solve a problem, the first rule is about having a problem solving orientation grounded in empirical data. That's one. Now, a second one that I would say is really important, and this is another one where you see it in our history, and we're not doing it today very well, which is the following. I call it deep empathetic listening. And what it means is that you're too young, Nicole, for this, but when I was in high school, we used to have a thing called debate clubs,
Yes.
where you would have to make an argument with backing it up with facts and sources to argue a case. And then sometimes the next day, you would have to actually make the counter argument. The point being is that deep listening involves really understanding a perspective, not by giving it lip service in a tweet, but by really understanding where people are coming from. Now, the reason why I say deep empathetic listening is so important, and it may sound trite, but I think, again, business leaders know that the problem solving space is enhanced if we have more perspectives. So,
Yeah.
by actually listening to other points of view, usually you've now increased the options for the problem solution set. So, it's actually a very beneficial thing. It's one
Yeah.
of the things that's kept us very strong as Americans. In fact, is our diversity. So there has to be the second rule in this secret sauce has to be a commitment to understanding other points of view and incorporating them into the solution space.
So, do you feel like people just aren't listening these days? They're just doing sound bites, and that is part of the problem? And is that one of the main things that's dividing us? I mean, or is there just one thing that's dividing us? I feel like because we're so conditioned now to alike, a quick response, a soundbite, that we have lost that ability, as you're saying, to listen deeply and to
Yes.
understand. And part of that, I think, is our society has put us like that. But if you're saying this is an issue from way back, were we not listening then?
Well, I think we were listening then, but like the examples that I use in the book show specifically how problem solvers over the course of our history were able to use other points of view. And I think you're right in that in today's media environment, it's more difficult,
Yeah.
but we have to force ourselves to do it. If we don't understand, if we, one of the, I'll just to jump to one of my pragmatic solutions, because in the third part of American Schism, I lay out a plan to move forward. And for example, I think it's fundamental that Americans, young Americans, spend some time in an environment that's different than the one they grew up in. I call it a national public service program, where if you do a year of service somewhere else in the country, we'll help you pay for your college or your training or whatever you want. But in other words, I'm not saying everyone should do military service. That was what my generation did.
Yeah.
But I think some notion of understanding other Americans and what we have in common is, if we're going to build a hierarchy of values, which is what the American ethic is, we have to put some work into it. And so that's an example of what are the behaviors and programs and institutions that we can instill that help this learning, this deep listening. And I think that that's where, as leaders, we can help institute certain programs, and that's very important. Now, so those are two. There's one third one. Again, I'm simplifying greatly for the perspective of getting this on the show for your listeners, but the third rule, or part of the secret sauce, is the following, and this is an interesting one. When you go into a problem-solving session, I think one has to have the understanding that you will not get everything you want. In other words, that compromise and compromising with other points of view and settling sometimes is really important. The way I frame this is that you can't let perfection be the enemy of the good.
Mhm.
So the whole way our country started was with, I mentioned this, the original American Schism, which was very divisive, and our founders found a way to compromise and create a constitution. And that example alone of how you forge a compromise is what allowed us to become a country. You know, and I know we don't have tons of time today, but that original American Schism divided people. Like, on one hand, you had Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Paine, and they were very opposed to the Federalists, John Adams and Alexander Hamilton. And that original schism is a lesson to learn how they forged a compromise. And sometimes I think in today's world, it feels like our political leaders often don't want to compromise. It's like,
Why is that? That was my question. Why are we unwilling to compromise? I find myself oftentimes being careful about how I say things. I don't want to offend anyone when you're
right,
out in public or if you're in an event, because all this, oh, well, you're a this, or oh,
right.
well, oh, well, you feel that way. How about I can feel some of both, and that still makes me a good person? And can't we work for the common good? Why are we having
Yeah.
trouble with that, Seth?
Okay, so I love this question, and I have a couple of ways to answer it. But what I would say is this: as humans, we're terribly tribal. We have this part of our brain that's from millions of years ago. It helped us evolve, and it's that part of the brain that is about fear or flight, or we're tribal. We want to be with people like us, who agree with us. It feels very good. You get an endorphin rush when your team wins and when you can insult the other team. It's why we love going to football games. I mean, sports is the way we sublimated these. It's interesting. For 2,000 years, back to the Greeks, we've sublimated these forces, recognizing they're not always productive by using sports. It's a very good outlet.
Yeah.
But here's the thing, Nicole. A sports arena is not the environment to solve a problem in the public sphere. It's not a way to do gun control or help
Right.
reduce shootings. It's not a
Right.
way to solve our immigration problems. So, basically we're using the wrong mindset. We're operating in our public sphere with serious problems as if we're in a wrestling ring. Now, I think there are many case and points in this. If you look, immigration is a very complex set of issues. And there are many sub issues related to the whole immigration problem. We need a comprehensive approach. We need secure borders. We need more agents at the border. We need also a better processing of amnesty and visas. We need a lot of things. So here's the thing, Nicole. For 4 times over the last 15 years, we've had a comprehensive immigration reform bill that has been on the floor of the House and Senate. Now, these bills, all 4 of them, they are not perfect. In other words, the Democrats don't always like them because they have things like quotas, and they don't call them quotas. But this last bill had pretty strong limits on immigration. The Republicans don't always like them because they have a path to citizenship for dreamers, people who were born here. The point is that they are not perfect for everyone, but they resolve a lot of problems. Now, I bring this up because if we had passed any one of these 4 bills, we would be much better off today than we are. We've been screaming at each other for 5 years now, and none of these problems are resolved. Our border is very porous. We have, by screaming at each other doesn't solve the problem. And I think immigration is a great example of that. There are many. Remember, when you say why, I mentioned, our mindset of this kind of amygdala-driven behavior. I think both elected officials reinforce that, as well as the media, because elected officials have realized quite a while ago, I think now, that the way to get people to the polls is not some detailed problem-solving argument. It's by pushing their buttons. It's by getting them angry or scared. And unfortunately, our elected officials should do better. We should demand that they don't always scare us, but that they solve problems. And I think both sides of the aisle are guilty of this. And, I think that we as Americans, if we're going to rise above this, we have to recognize that we need to compromise and we need to avoid situations where we're using something as a wedge issue to push a button. Or I sometimes say elected officials seem to be better at keeping problems brewing, than in solving them, and that's unfortunate.
How do we
We have to
change
change our
that
mind.
though? How do we you have to get new people in there with a different mindset, or what?
Okay,
How do we
so
change it?
let me explain. So, as I mentioned, the third part of the book lays out a plan, and I would say that this plan involves 2 fundamental parts. On one hand, you have what I call mindset changes. We have to change how we relate to each other as citizens. We're not all enemies. 70 million people that voted for one side or the other are not all bad people. So we
Right.
have to go through a mindset change, number one. Number two, there are certain structural reforms that we need to deal with what are very powerful incentive systems that are bad. So our incentive systems in our elected process is really messed up. Let me give an example. So let's say, and this is hypothetical, but I think your listeners can relate to it. You know, if you look at the data today, 8% of the electorate elects 85% of our House seats. Only 8%. Now, why? Because almost 90% of the districts are safe. They've been gerrymandered. Okay, so they're either safe red or blue. So let's say I'm a Republican congresswoman in Kentucky 8, which is a safe red district. In my term, my 2 years, if I dare cooperate with the Democrat to solve a problem, I'm going to be primaried. Now, In the primary, it's a closed primary, so independents can't vote. That takes a third of the electorate out. The rest who actually do show up and vote on the primary are usually the diehards. Too many of them fit into the extremes, whether it's left or right. So what I'm saying is an incentive in the system itself to create polarization.
Yeah.
And there's many cases of this. Now, here's what's ironic about this, Nicole. None of this is in the Constitution. None of this is required by our blueprint in the country. These are all local, state-driven election laws that have evolved. So
Yeah.
why is it that we have closed primaries in so many states where a third of the people who are not registered as either Democrat or Republican, they can't vote at all? What's that about? Why do we
Right.
have things like gerrymandering, which make these districts so uncompetitive? Um, so those are two examples. When I say structural changes, we are actually working right now across the country on opening up primaries and redistricting in a nonpartisan way. I'll give you one other interesting example. Um, there's something called ranked choice voting, which is a different kind of way of voting. It happens a lot, and it's happening more and more on the local level. It's powerful. What ranked choice voting does, it's basically, when you go to the booth, you put your first choice, but you put a second or third choice as well. That's basically what it comes down to, in case that first choice doesn't win. And the way it works is, instead of having two candidates, a Democrat and a Republican, you can have five candidates. And they get winnowed out. So in other words, if I pick one that's my number one is the last place, then all of a sudden my second vote counts. So the ranked choice voting has been shown to be more representative of what voters want. And another interesting thing about it, some folks say it's confusing. It really isn't. What it does is it forces the candidates themselves to appeal to a broader selection of the populace. Because in other words, if they're not number one, they want to be number two. So candidates have to be more attractive. They have to be less about criticizing and focusing on their base and more. They have to build their base more. So those are three structural examples of how we can um, improve and take away some of the bad incentives. Now, I mentioned those three because none of them require amendment. They're all driven by local regulations. Now, there is one that requires probably more heavy duty constitutional amendment, and that's what I call money in politics. I think that's a problem too. We have allowed special interests to really drive the conversation, and it's just it approaches too much corruption. It's not how our founders intended the system to be. So that one is a little trickier, but I do work on that as well, campaign finance reform, but that requires more deep change. Anyway, I want to bring up just those three examples as structural changes that are actually happening. And they're
It's
happening though more on the grassroots state and local level than at the federal level.
Don't you feel though, Seth, that's really where things have to begin? You have to start at the local level, the grassroots, and move your way to the top to make that change?
It's very astute of you to say that, because if you look at the big changes over the course of our history, like women getting the right to vote, these things happened at local levels. They built up. States gradually saw so in other words, usually yes, the movements that have succeeded have happened first locally and built up a grassroots support base. So absolutely, and it's happening. If you look at what happened in Alaska, I think I have actually a deck here that shows, I think in 14 states this November, we have ballot initiatives that are putting things in like ranked choice voting or open primaries or dealing with all these structural issues. So just to remind your listeners, it's about mindset change, how we talk to each other, and structural change. And I'm hopeful that your listeners will reach out and take a look at American Schism. And they can certainly also reach out for me at my website, AmericanSchismBook.com, and shoot me an email. Or I love listening to and hearing from readers. I think it's
Yeah.
so important, going back to what we started with, Nicole, that the frustrated majority, us, that we who believe in problem solving and believe in the future for the country, that we wrestle back the gavel from the lunatics who are sometimes running the asylum. And we've got to do that. And which is why, by the way, I was so excited to come on your show, because I think discussions like this are really part of the solution.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's talking about it, getting the information out, trying to bring people together so that we can pause and actually listen to one another and use that information to say, you know what? That's a good bit of information there that Seth just shared, or someone else brings something to the table. How can we work this for the better, for the good, for all of us, and be united rather than divided? We don't all have to agree on everything, but
Right.
one thing I would hope that as Americans we would all agree on is that we live in a great country. I want to be a part of a better country, a better community for future generations. That just seems like a given.
And it's we have real problems. I mean, we do have to deal with climate change. We have to deal with the wars raging in the world. I mean, here's the thing. We've had a lot of problems. We've had problems in our history, but despite all of our warts and blemishes, I still believe America is the best example of self-government in the history of the written world. And so we have to preserve that. We want our kids to have that. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm an example of the American dream. My grandparents came here with nothing, and I was able to build a wonderful career. And isn't that the promise of America? Isn't that what we all believe in? That's such a powerful idea. And I think our kids today lose sight of that. It's
I was
worth
going to say
fighting
the
for.
same thing. Yes, and, you talked about children, young adults going to different countries, doing work in third world countries so they could see how blessed they are. That would change their mindset. Really, this is what you're saying is we have to have a mindset change, and we have to have a system change.
Yes, exactly. And the mindset changes. Sometimes when people ask me, this is a long term thing. I say yes. It's there are implications for education. I think we really have to look at how our youth use social media. In my view, I'm not one of these guys that say, I have an 18-year-old, and I wish we had been a little firmer in saying no. I don't know if you have kids, but it's hard. It's a hard, but you need to have this more reflective, thoughtful understanding of where people are coming from, and that requires a little less internet and a little more reading and thinking, in my view. But anyway, so it may take some time, and I think things like civics is important in school. We can't let that go away. Some of the enlighteners, some of the great philosophers who were responsible for the Enlightenment, which led to our country, knew that if we were going to have a democratic republic, we needed to educate the citizenry. It requires people to be engaged. We have to care about each other. I care about how your kids are doing, and our communities matter. And so much of America in the last 40 years, because of economic policies that like globalization, have been hurt. And that's some of the anger you see today. It comes from us not addressing the breakdown in communities all over the country. So that's important as well.
Mm. So many good topics, and you know what though? Listening to you, I believe there's hope, that we have to continue to have hope. We've seen the pattern throughout the history of this country. You've noted it in your book. I want folks to go and read your book so they'll have a better understanding, because there is hope of a better future. We just have to learn to work together, right?
Absolutely. So one of the projects I'm working on right now is called the Grand Bargain Project. And it literally takes these issues that 90% of Americans agree with, like we have to resolve the debt. We can't keep giving this debt to our kids. We have to find a way to get reasonable gun control. I mean, nobody wants to take away a Second Amendment right, but we can't let just anyone have an automatic rifle. There are certain things that are so basic that we all agree. So the Grand Bargain Project is trying to focus on those big things, and realize that we can get some stuff done.
Yeah. I like that. So, in closing, remind folks again where they can
Sure.
get your book, learn more about you, and learn more about these future projects that you're involved in.
Terrific. The book is called American Schism. It's available on Amazon or wherever books are sold. And it did win the International Book Award last year, so it's done quite well. And I would love to hear from listeners. They can get it at americanschismbook.com. Now, it's a little tricky because schism's a weird word. American, SCHISM book.com. Hopefully
Yeah.
they'll find that. And
Yes.
I'd love to hear from readers. And thank you so much for having me.
Can't thank you enough for being my guest today. Come back and join me again sometime.
Would love to. Thank you.
All right. That will do it for this edition of Conversations with Nicole. Until I see you again, I hope you have a great day.